been operating under extreme precautions to limit community transmission and outbreaks while allowing some activity to resume. We saw just over 1 million South Africans return to work, and then there were obviously some concerns relating to that about the economy having being opened up too soon. We saw a lot of shopping centres where there'd been a lot of traffic towards those particular areas, and concerns about the increasing number of infections in the country and the increasing number of deaths as well. So if you look at these particular restrictions, every person is confined to his or her place of residence from 8 p.m. to 5 a.m. That is what we're operating under at this particular time. There's been no local or interprovincial movement of people. Level 4, the sectors that were permitted, food and retail, we've been able to go out and buy our food, fiber optic and IT services. If you had to have your something installed in your home, you would be able to get some assistance pertaining to that. All financial and professional services, those two have been operating. The transport restrictions, bus services, taxi services, e-hailing services, private motor vehicles operating at all times of the day with limitations on the vehicle capacity. So that is what's been taking place. Personal movement, as I indicated, still no interprovincial travel permitted, people staying at home. And what has been happening, even at level 5, is people only leaving home for essential work and buying essential goods. All right, let's go to level 3 now. If there would be a likelihood of that taking place in the next few moments, flying back, but only limited domestic air travel. So if the president does announce at 8:30 that we're moving to level 3 as a country, in terms of transport, limited domestic travel and restricted number of daily flights. So some movement there, some flights, but you're unlikely to see the borders under level 3, if that does happen, open. Let's take a look at manufacturing now. What will be permitted under level 3? Agriculture, hunting, forestry and fishing, electricity, gas and water supply, manufacturing of paper products, cement and other construction. We've seen a lot of construction sites that had been very busy prior to the lockdown, all basically coming to a standstill. Winter clothes, bedding and heaters. We already have all of that in place. That has been announced already. The automotive industry, huge for parts like the Eastern Cape as well. So with the automotive industry, that would be permitted under level 3 if that is announced by President Cyril Ramaphosa at 8:30. Let's take a look at mining now, what exactly will take place. All mining activities will resume under level 3. Very short and sweet, but of course all of that dependent on what the president will say. Wholesale, retail, informal traders permitted. We know there's been a large bone of contention regarding informal traders, millions of them operating, and them being at the coalface of, having to suffer under what is currently taking place, concerns about when they'll be allowed to trade again. So under level 3, food products, sanitary pads, animal food, tobacco products. There'll be a lot of people, I guess, will be excited about that. That has been a huge bone of discussion in South Africa. Off-premises alcohol consumption, Monday to Wednesday, 8 to 12 p.m. If that does happen, I guess there'll be many South Africans who will have a lot to say about that this evening. So I know a lot of you are holding thumbs. You're probably guessing that because I keep on saying level 3, level 3. Wait a minute. We're still waiting for the president to address us this evening. And all right, we're going to get some pre-analysis on what the president is likely to say. What is he expected to take into consideration? The president, of course, addressing the nation, expected at 8:30. Let's see if he'll be on time. The director of the Orwell Socioeconomic Research Institute, Angelo Fick, joins me via Skype. He's also joined by Sandile Swano. He's a lecturer at the Wits School of Governance. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us this evening. So let me start with any of you. Angela, let me start with you. So to move to level 3 or not, we will know very shortly. But could we see, variegated levels of differently affected areas, in particular if we look at places like the Western Cape?
So I think that's what many people are agitating, particularly at the local government level, and those businesses and ordinary people who have to engage with local government, that they would like to see if they're in an area that hasn't seen the effect as severely as places like the big metros, that they should not necessarily have to be subjected to those extremes. But that's one option that could be proposed, but that would also require of cooperation on inter-region and inter-district maneuvers, because it is pointless to be a well-functioning district, have yourself exempted from extreme prohibitions, and only then to flash back to level 5 because things happen between the districts from what's happening next door.
And if we just look at perhaps, Angelo, we're speculating at the moment, if the president does announce that we would move to level 3 as a country, we're talking about a certain level of domestic travel. How do you balance that versus not getting, some of the provinces, for example, like the Eastern Cape, that already had challenges with that window period of travel, where you had a number of people from the Western Cape who would travel to the Eastern Cape who tested positive for the COVID-19 virus? Strike a balance between that and having the economy somewhat moving again.
So here I think we need to distinguish between leisure passenger travel and the essential goods travel that trade requires. So there is intra-provincial trade that is necessary to the sustenance of the South African economy. And the airports in the major metros are crucial to that. And that's not just because goods move between the metros, but the employment situations around those airports are crucial. And so I think this is a fine balancing act for government to run. But there is no avoiding the infection. And that is what Professor Salim Abdul Karim told us a few weeks ago. What we have to know from tonight's speech is whether the health system is prepared, whether the PPE manufacturing is on track, whether the hospitals set up to receive people are in place, and then also, in addition to that, what issues in the economy have been addressed by the various grants and mechanisms put in place, and what success they've had.
Sandile, what are you expecting to hear from the president? Angelo says, the health sector's preparedness could be something that could come up. The president will obviously need to assure South Africans that the health sector itself is prepared for what we're even expecting in the next couple of months to be a spike. What would you like to hear from the president? What do you think he'll say?
Well, certainly he has to confirm that the preparations have gone to whatever extent they've gone to. Our health sector has not been in the best of shapes, so there will be some degree of preparation. But I would also like to just raise another concern to add to what Angelo has said here, that the spike in infections from day one, as Dr. Zweli Mkhize made it clear that there's going to be an inevitable spike in infections. So South Africans cannot now turn around and say there's a problem because the infections are going up. That's exactly what we expected. So at the same time, there is a point that needs to be considered here, which the DA has raised. If, for instance, infections are rising, but rising amongst people who are young, healthy, strong, and the percentage of people who are vulnerable, people with pre-existing medical conditions, etc., then indeed there is the risk is very different in those cases, and therefore the preparation of these facilities, etc., has to be very detailed and very specific in terms of the profiles, the demographic profiles of those areas. I'll stop there for now on the health issue. But that type of detail is also relevant to the economy, but I'll answer that later.
For example, you mentioned there, Angela, details on the manufacturing of personal protective equipment and essential goods needed in the months and years ahead. Is this a plan that South Africa needs to look to assure South Africans, perhaps if the president mentions that today, that will give South Africans a sense of we continue to know what we are doing?
So there is that component of having transparent governance, which we must return to as a matter of urgency. We cannot have a government that is operating in blind alleys from citizen scrutiny. Parliamentary committees have returned, we've seen over the last couple of weeks, and that means that there is some administrative oversight. But I think South Africans also need to realize, as many people around the world have to, that the world cannot return in any way whatsoever in the near future to what we had on March 25 or February 2020. The world's supply chains will have to shift. Our priorities will have to shift. What counts as viable economic activity will have to shift. The philosopher John Gray has pointed out that whole sectors of the economy that were considered, very successful over the last 15 years will probably disappear because the world that sustained them will disappear if there is a pathogen in place. Tourism will have to shift. The gig economy will probably suffer large numbers. And so the education system that supplies people for that economy will have to shift its priorities as well. So this is wholesale social change. We have seen versions of this in history. We're likely to have to do fairly on the hoof, quick changes to adapt to this.
And Sandile, I can imagine with the president having met the National Coronavirus Command Council earlier today, it would be ideal also to get an update on some of the hunger alleviation measures that were put in place, the progress on the economic stimulus package and how businesses themselves will continue to get assistance, in particular those who've not been able to operate under the current levels that we've already been through.
Yes, I think there's something also that needs to preface all of that. If we're to just take this as an example of a household, let's say you've got to stay at home for 4 months, not working. The question of how much you have in your bank account matters. What can you afford? Even at a national level, even if we include the IMF and World Bank, if everybody in the world is in crisis, how much can we sustain with the economy closed down? Number one. Number two, how accurate are we able to target those most vulnerable groups, and how successful have we been? All those statistics have got to be put on the table, and they need to be distributed to all the parties, political parties, unions. Everybody needs to know. So the president has got to give us information. And I was listening earlier on that what is in these packages, food packages, is also not enough for a family. So there's a lot of science that needs to go into these things, which has not yet started going into them. But he needs to be telling us how all of that is going to be corrected, particularly if we're going to continue to be under lockdown of any kind.
Angelo, one of the issues, that government has been quite proactive in, the food banks, food and shelter insecurity, millions of people have been affected. And, with the impending winter, what is government's plan for South Africa? Does the health system have a proper plan in place to ensure that it is able to deal with the spike that is expected?
So we've seen some responses from local officials on the ground of these field hospitals and shelters that are being prepared, but we cannot see a repeat of what we saw in March and early April of simply rounding people up and putting them in stadia. Winter is coming. We know that every year in mid-year that there is a crisis around the areas that get mid-year rain, the Western Cape, one example of that, for homeless people and people in very precarious shelters. And so since we have heard from the World Health Organization and from various studies on the ground that this disease is likely to be with us for a few years, we cannot simply plan for the day ahead of us, the week that's coming up. We need to start thinking into the future beyond merely this year. But for the winter ahead, certainly what kind of food security is available. And here I think it requires a wholesale reimagination of economic activity and of social, compacts that lead into that economic activity. The idea that we can simply have the inequalities from before continue, that I think is gone.
Sorry, Angelo, I think you cut a bit there towards the end. Please continue.
So what I was saying is that the inequality of the economy from before is not something that we can simply return to. Some of those inequalities are precisely why we sit with the health inequalities that we now have to face and undo. Homelessness in South Africa certainly is one issue that has to be addressed. The health challenges that follow that has to be addressed. And in a country where there are thousands of empty buildings that we sit with right now, where people still continue to have to live on the street, that is truly unacceptable. And so when we start thinking of food parcels as well, this shouldn't just be emergency aid food parcels. This should be an agricultural sector that is geared towards providing food for the millions of people who are going hungry. This is not a poor country. This is a highly unequal country. And those inequalities of wealth and of income must be addressed as a matter of urgency.
Sandy, let me bring you in there. I mean, there's been some criticism I saw of, some comparison between when President Cyril Ramaphosa addresses the nation. I saw the minister in the presidency, Jackson Mthembu, basically saying that the president addresses the nation when there is something basically to add to what he's previously said. Some criticism that some countries like the United States addressing President Donald Trump, for example, addressing his nation every evening. Is there anything to warrant off something like that?
I don't want to turn this into a joke, but I think the addresses by President Trump are also a liability, if you've been watching them. I think that some people have said quite clearly that certainly Dr. Zwelimkis has handled the issue very well. And also we've seen in previous cases, for instance, the ESCOM crisis, where a person who doesn't know the subject, including the president, stands up and talks a lot and then in the process embarrasses all of us. So there is a need. In this case, by accident, we've been very fortunate to have a person, for instance, of the caliber of Dr. Zwelimkis, who went to medical school, who can talk about this. But I think then the other issue now that is kicking in, which I am not sure if this command council is properly catered for, is that this needs to be a thoroughly interdisciplinary team. When I say interdisciplinary, I don't mean that we must have vaccinologists, immunologists, epidemiologists. We need industrial engineers, we need supply chain experts, we need all kinds of health and safety experts, all kinds of people who can also look at other issues that can actually help us. So I don't think that Cyril Ramaphosa needs to directly involve himself in things that he actually does not know what he's talking about.
And your take on that, Angelo?
I agree, and I think that, we don't need a cabinet of experts. What we need is a civil service that has all sorts of fairly well-qualified senior officials who can advise, because if we're going to have this really diverse set of issues in different parts of the country, it cannot simply be a top-down governance issue. There will have to be consultation from the bottom up. And that, I think, is crucial. So here I think the agreement is that we do need a variety of inputs, but also there are things that some of us, despite our high levels of education, know nothing about. And here it's not about kowtowing to medical scientists, but a higher degree in the humanities for many of us allows us to look at these things logically, but we may not always all have the same kind of basic science understanding of how a virus works, how infected it is. And so the kinds of solutions that one often hears from people who are experts in one field on another field is something that some of us are, quite reticent about. I think a multidisciplinary approach is crucial, but in the end, if you're dealing with a medical emergency, those without a medical education, people like myself, have to sit back and think very carefully about what we do, what we say, how we give input on what the medical science and their research tells us about this issue of a pathogen.
So whatever happens, certainly, there's been a little bit of criticism here and there about the government's messaging since the start of the outbreak of the coronavirus in South Africa. Going forward, what would then need to happen within that collective of the National Coronavirus Command Council? Because we saw a bit of dilly-dallying in the past about certain regulations, changes there, moving back to a certain aspect, allegations of pressure being put from certain sectors of society. How does government, in terms of leadership in this particular aspect, in the form of President Cyril Ramaphosa, need to be seen to be more decisive? Because you've also got instances where you've got the Finance Minister, Tito Mboweni, who's tweeting in the very dark hours of the evening, seeming to portray that there isn't a sense of unity within this so-called collective decision-making body.
If the question is to me, okay. I think...
Any one of you gentlemen.
Ahead,
okay. I think that at the end of the day, they have tried to say this is how we're going to communicate. And there have been cases where they themselves were not properly coordinated. I think we've seen that. This last point that you are making, I think all of us have to agree that you cannot be part of a committee in any structure. It doesn't matter what structure it is. Once you've decided to be part of a committee, you cannot then go and voice your differences, particularly if you are dealing with an emergency. In an emergency, there must be unity of command. So the practices that Tito Mboweni has been exercising cannot be accepted in a state of disaster or state of emergency and so on. It's just not on. The debate is over once it's over. And I think the other side of it, South Africa as a whole, I think we have not been running a tight ship. And this emergency has meant that our structures and our processes are not streamlined in government. And that needs to be attended to. Without putting any criticism and blame on Cyril Ramaphosa, I don't think I would want to blame him for anything in this case. I think government for the longest time has been very, very loose. And I think they are being exposed now that they've got to start having streamlined processes, which they do not have.
Angela, you agree that government seemingly, in few instances, looking quite loose?
Yes, and I think we have for a very long time had a situation where people who have ministerial positions don't understand or seem not to care that their utterances become policy utterances. A minister who tweets is not tweeting in his or her personal capacity. That is long gone. A minister tweets, and that has policy consequences. And more than that, it has consequences for how government is perceived both inside the country and outside the country. So if the Minister of Finance is in a situation where he is trying to attract investment, suggesting that his ideas are not being followed by government in a tweet is, I think, absurd. It does lead to perceptions of disunity and perceptions of, divisions inside cabinet. And beyond that, I think if you are sitting in a government where your policies are not being adhered to and you don't find that palatable, the honorable thing to do is to resign, to give the job to somebody else. But you cannot have somebody who continues to dissent from the policy that is proposed, and also somebody who's not a new member of the African National Congress and so happens to know exactly how African National Congress policy issues work in relation to government policy issues, continue to do this. This kind of petulant behavior is one unbecoming of ministerial conduct, but secondly quite destructive.
But it's not just him. I mean, we've seen the likes of Trevor Manuel as well, basically, I won't say blast, that might be quite a strong word, but also, say that some of the lockdown regulations don't make any sense. We should move down to a level 3, and that, this is someone who is part of the president's special envoy to go and basically galvanize support for how the continent as a whole is going to deal with the impact of the coronavirus.
Yeah, my reading of Trevor Manuel is that
All right, let me bring you in there, Sandile. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think that there's a big problem that we have. That problem, we'll look at it in government, we'll also look at it within the ruling party. My personal view, people like Trevor Manuel, I'm saying people like him, not just him, there are issues that they should have tackled inside the ruling party itself for the past 12 years, and they allow the country to run into total chaos without actually voicing and challenging issues successfully inside the ruling party. Now they are in government, there's a little bit of democratic space, and that space is being abused by loose statements that can never be possible, have no chance of ever adding value. Now, let me add this last point to this. All these politicians, inside the ANC, outside the ANC, have got certain constituencies that they represent. For instance, the biggest mining companies are saying they cannot operate successfully under these conditions. Therefore, they need to be given 100% opportunity to operate with full staff, full everything. And other sectors are doing the same, and they go to certain politicians and pressurize those politicians to make certain statements. I think that is the breakdown in discipline that is happening here. And Trevor Manuel is part of it.
Certainly that breakdown in discipline, Angelo, cannot be seen to be so blatant in the face of ordinary South Africans if the president himself wants to be seen to be in charge of this fight against the coronavirus.
Well, I think that there's a big man theory of history where people believe that this individual or that individual, whatever you want to name him or her, is going to somehow resolve the issue and that things are decided from within an individual perspective and everybody else runs into. We've seen this when people start referring to the President of the Republic of South Africa as the Commander-in-Chief, as if we're in some kind of military lockdown, as if this is the state of martial law. This is unacceptable. The President of the Democratic Republic of South Africa may be the nominal head of the armed forces, but he's actually, in this case, the civilian elected President of the Republic of South Africa and should be treated as such. Yeah. He is the chief civil servant who is accountable to people, and his words should not be some kind of command for the rest of us. Similarly, when we start hearing that people at the top of the Defence Force went into Parliament and indicated to the people's elected representatives that they are not the client of the parliamentary precinct, but that they only account to the President, is absurd. This means that this person does not understand this, and so therefore must be let go. This person
All right, Angelo, I'm afraid we're going to have to catch you there. We'll have to go live now to the Union buildings. President Cyril Ramaphosa is taking to the podium.
119th death from the disease. Every life lost is a tragedy. These 200